In December 1969, millions of young American men sat glued to their radios and televisions. A hand reached into a glass bowl filled with blue capsules, each containing a date, one of the 366 days in a year. That hand belonged to Congressman Alexander Perny. When he drew the first capsule, the date inside was September 14th. If you were born on September 14th, 1944, your number had just come up. You were first in line to be drafted into the Vietnam War. For thousands of families, this was more than a lottery. It was a roll of fate, a game that would decide who would go, who would stay, and who might never return. This is the story of the Vietnam draft, how it began, how it divided a nation, and how it changed America forever. To understand the draft, we have to go back to the beginning. In 1965, the United States had already been involved in Vietnam for years, first through military advisors, then with combat troops. The Cold War was in full swing, and Washington believed that if South Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Asia would follow, the infamous domino theory. At first, President Lyndon B. Johnson promised that America wouldn't need more troops. But by mid-1965, the war was escalating fast. That year, there were just 184,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. By the end of 1968, there were more than 540,000. The volunteer military couldn't keep up with those numbers. So the government turned to the selective service system, the draft. Every man between 18 and 26 had to register. Draft boards existed in every county, often run by local men who decided who would go and who would stay. It wasn't fair. College students, especially those from wealthier families, could apply for deferments. Others joined the National Guard to avoid combat. Poor and working-class young men, especially African Americans and rural whites, had fewer options. As one veteran later said, it wasn't the rich kids who went. It was the guys whose dads couldn't pull strings. The draft boards were small, sometimes just 3 or 4 men, but they had enormous power. They could decide based on local knowledge who had essential skills, who got a student deferment, and who was fit for service. And because they weren't federal employees, their decisions often reflected personal bias. If you were the son of a local doctor or businessman, you might get a deferment. If you were a factory worker's kid, you probably wouldn't. In some towns, rumors swirled that certain families never had to worry about their sons being called. By 1966, resentment was growing. The slogan, "Old enough to fight, old enough to vote," became a rallying cry for fairness, since the voting age was still 21, but the draft age was 18. Every young man knew someone who'd been drafted. They watched friends disappear one by one. Some came back changed, others didn't come back at all. If you were drafted, you received a letter, the famous greetings from the president. Greetings. You are hereby ordered for induction into the armed forces of the United States. It didn't feel like a greeting. It felt like a sentence. Many were sent to boot camp with little idea of where they were going or why. Some tried to fail the physical. Others fled to Canada. Between 1964 and 1973, over 2 million Americans were drafted. Nearly 58,000 would never return home. Dear Mom and Dad, they told us we're shipping out next week. I'm scared, but trying not to show it. Tell Sis I'll write when I can. Love, Tommy. That letter was never finished. Tommy's name is now on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. By 1967, America was boiling. College campuses erupted in protest. Students burned draft cards, an act that became both a political statement and a federal crime. In New York, thousands marched to the Pentagon chanting, "Hell no, we won't go." In Washington, mothers held candles for their sons. The nation was divided, not just between hawks and doves, but between generations. President Johnson defended the war, saying it was America's duty to stop communism. But more and more Americans began asking, at what cost? The protests weren't just about Vietnam. They were about fairness, equality, and trust. And when television began showing body bags coming home each night, the draft became the lightning rod for all that anger. By 1969, public confidence in the draft was in ruins. So the Nixon administration decided to make a change, a fairer system, the draft lottery. On December 1st, 1969, the first televised lottery since World War II began. Congressman Perny reached into a transparent drum and pulled out one blue capsule. Inside, September 14th. Birthdays were matched to numbers. Lower numbers meant you were more likely to be called up. Men gathered around radios and TV sets, waiting to hear their birthdays. Some cheered when their number was high. Others went silent. One young man said later, "My birthday came up number 3. I remember my mother crying in the kitchen." Though it was meant to bring fairness, the lottery didn't end the fear or the anger. It just made it official. Between 1965 and 1973, about 2.2 million Americans were drafted. Nearly 25% of total Vietnam combat deaths came from draftees, often younger, less trained, and less motivated than volunteers. But their courage was real. They fought in the jungles of Khe Sanh, Hue, and the Mekong Delta. They endured monsoons, ambushes, and invisible enemies. Some never fired their weapons. Others saw horrors they could never forget. They call this place the Green Hell. I can't tell one hill from another. The guys keep talking about home, about cars, girls, football. It keeps us sane. When those soldiers came home, many were met not with parades but with silence or even hostility. The draft didn't just send men to war, it fractured the bond between the military and the public. In 1973, as the last American troops left Vietnam, the draft officially ended. President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would move to an all-volunteer military. The selective service system remained, but no one would be drafted again. The damage, however, was already done. The draft had taken more than lives. It had taken trust. It had forced a generation to question authority, patriotism, and even morality. But it also sparked reform. Voting age lowered to 18. Deferments became a symbol of inequality, fueling future calls for fairness. And for those who served, whether drafted or volunteered, the bond of brotherhood endures. The Vietnam draft remains one of the most controversial chapters in American history. For some, it was a duty. For others, a nightmare. But for everyone, it was a reminder of how the fate of an entire generation can be decided by a number pulled from a glass bowl. Today, those numbers, those letters, and those names are etched into memory and into stone.